Randy, right?
Yeah.
Please.
Father in heaven, we are met here today to try to put some thoughts together that will benefit our city, that we love. We pray thy spirit to be with us, that we may do so in peace and harmony. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.
So I suppose we got to follow the roll. This will be a little memory test. So we have Ben, AKA Rick on the Bayou. We got it. Me, Doug Anderson, Steve Thompson, Nate
Wrestler, Chris Paul.
Chris Palmer. And you, I don't.
Jamie Jones.
You are the famous genius.
Davey Cochran. Brenda Ashdown.
In the back row, oh, let's see, we have John Paul.
John Paul,
we got
yeah.
Dan Center there. And here I recognize the mayor. And who are you two other gentlemen?
Just sitting by watching.
They're not watching on video, but they're watching in here, right? They're
And
attending.
Sergeant at Arms. in case you're talking
Yeah.
about that, right?
He could do that.
Do tell us your names, please. What's your name?
Kevin Burns.
Kevin Burns, red jacket, and
I'm Bryce. I'm the city treasurer.
Bryce, city treasurer. We're good. Well, I was informed that Brenda and I would be the
Oh,
co-chair.
Sandy is, I am not. We talked about it.
Forgive me, I was
The
looking
last-
at you, Sandy.
Yes,
and
you were.
and
but-
Brenda came up. Okay, so maybe we have two different chairs, somebody that can not mess up. But anyway, Sandy,
Mhm.
thanks for being here. I'm not sure where to start. Maybe we turn it over to you, John, since this meeting was appointed by the city and you kind of volunteered, so you've got an agenda there.
Yeah, it's a pretty short agenda. But kind of the first part that's focused on the training, we're hoping will be, don't have a lot of PowerPoints because I think sometimes there's death by PowerPoint. But I'm gonna bring up one non-PowerPoint to just kind of get us started in the discussion. And the whole point of this conversation is just to, it's not just for everyone in the room, because a lot of you have skills that have helped get you become a part of this committee and backgrounds, but this, in case residents want to watch it, this is kind of a budget 101 with city. If there's anything I say that I use an acronym, tell me to stop, because we don't want to use acronyms, but we will use some terms that Jamie and I and Bryce use all the time that others don't necessarily. It doesn't always make sense to folks who don't do government accounting. So it's just to kind of have almost a roundtable discussion, make sure everyone's on the same page. And just first off, this is stole this from a website, but this is what it says is the purpose of government accounting, which is the recording of expenses and revenues related to governmental activities, minimizing expenses
John,
where possible.
are you gonna have handouts so we don't have to write all this down?
I will get this emailed out to you. This is the only item that is on the screen for that reason. Because I sometimes if you're messing with papers and stuff, you get more focused on that. So minimizing expenses, which is I think why some people are here, because that's the question that came up that helped formulate this group is there a way to minimize expenses? Then controlling expenditures within the set budget, that's heavily on the mayor, the liaisons, or the council liaisons, Jamie, myself, and the department heads. Providing information related to the expenditure and budgets. Jamie works with our auditors and our financial consultants to get our financial statements ready. The security and protection of government property, that's an auditor role. They make sure Jamie is doing things right and that Bryce is doing things right. Maintaining fiscal accountability, that again kind of falls on the whole group of individuals, with the auditor giving some information back in the annual reports. And then this allocation of revenue. So the thing that's unique and different about government from business is oftentimes businesses get focused on profit and growth, right? The idea is make it bigger, make more money. The city obviously has goals of some increases in revenues to help covering increased expenses, but they're usually tied closer together. It's not just willy-nilly revenues go up because we want more revenues. It's usually tied to stuff. The mayor's smirking at me because that's not always the perception.
How business ran.
Willy-nilly, yeah, you just,
Increase your revenue.
well, and again, one of the fundamental differences is that government has, in a lot of ways, much more control over its revenues. In the sense that in some regards, we could raise property taxes as much as we want. We don't do that because politically that's a nightmare for the council, but it does go up, right? And so, North Ogden has had 20 years, or it had 17 years of no tax increases. And then the past 3 years, there's been tax increases on property tax. And one of the biggest things that's most confusing for residents to understand is when you get your property tax bill from the county, my house, so I live here in the city, was $3,300 this year. And 300 of it was North Ogden money. The other 3,000 went to other entities in the county, right? So all the increases that would happen on my property for those 20 years, the majority of them were going to other entities and not to the city. But obviously the city did a pretty big bump this last year at 20%, 19%. So any questions about like the goals? And I really, these two are highlighted in gray because gray is a great color to highlight stuff in. That's kind of where I see the purpose of this group right now. But please, like, help us understand like the direction this group wants to go, because moving forward, I think the goal will be for this group to kind of set your own agendas and explore the topics that this group wants to explore in a meaningful way, so that we're getting to the stuff that you want to get to, not to the stuff that we're trying to give you, if that makes sense.
I think you're accurate in your highlighting.
Okay.
Really.
Just maybe I should have gone yellow or something. It might be because all I've done is selected it and I was going to highlight it. Yeah, I was getting ready to highlight it and I got distracted. So, but I'll send this out. I'll even send you the rest of the notes I have that I'm going to be talking from. Because I think it's helpful. Jamie's going to jump in whenever she feels inclined to. The mayor will, Councilman Swanson will. And really, if anyone has questions as we're going through, like, this is, the whole purpose is to have a discussion. And I did bring an object lesson, and it has twofold, it has some benefits because it's candy. So this is the best example of what most people think that government revenues look like. It's all one pot, it's one little bit of money. It's all the same. It can be spent however it wants. And the reality is government revenue is more like this. And this is even more deceptive than you might otherwise think. The mayor successfully, right? You only got M&Ms. So in that pot is M&M's, Skittles, and Reese's Pieces. So if anyone, I mean, well, I was gonna say, we got some plates and
It's still in the letter.
hey Chris, will you? So if you feel free to really dig in, pour some out on your plate. We got plenty. But the whole point is that in that pot, there's different colors, different candies, different everything. And the reason I'm trying to use this as an analogy is that we get revenues and even just funds that are just so different and so diverse that not everyone is able to. The only person who understands every little piece of information is Jamie, and she knows that she's not the only one that gets it, but Jamie can find every dollar in the city because of her background and her skill set. The next thing to probably move on to is there's a couple different type of funds that we have in the city. And if you, we're going to start ignoring the projector now because it's not, I don't have any more notes because again, I don't want us to get lost in it, but I'll send you this all. But there's general fund dollars, there's special revenue fund dollars. North Ogden City kind of has debt service fund accounts. We transfer into it and then transfer out immediately. Those are the things for the bonds. There's capital projects money, and then North Ogden is like most cities in that we have enterprise funds. So now I'm going to go back and explain each of those, and Jamie's going to tell me where I'm wrong. General fund is the stuff that most people think of when they think of city. That's police, that's parks, that's administration. And there's building and HR, and there's a whole lot of other little things tied up in there. But that's the stuff that most people think of when they think of government spending. The counterintuitive thing, or the reason that we call this next batch the enterprise funds, and I know I'm skipping around, that's why I don't put it on the screen because of the way I knew this would go. Enterprise funds are your water, your sewer, your storm water, and your trash, your solid waste. So those are different from the general fund because those are activities that there are private industries that actually operate those. Bonta Vista Water provides water to lots of the cities around us. And the city doesn't provide water. Where in North Ogden City provides the water. So according to the state auditor, those are a business related activity, meaning it operates like a business. Not necessarily a for-profit business, but it operates more like a business.
That's the name enterprise.
That's the name enterprise. But this is where we get into one of those terms of art. Enterprise is what we call it when we're talking about it. The auditors call it business activities. Like that's what it shows up on the financial statements is business related activities. And it does break it down to storm, water, sewer, all those sort of things. But those are the things. Water is probably the next thing that most people think of as a municipal service. When in reality, there's probably 30% of the country where the water is provided by the government entity. The rest are provided by private entities. There is one group in this, and this is in case you're on Jeopardy one day, stormwater. There is no private entity that does stormwater. It's always a government entity or a government service. However, in this situation, it's still categorized as an enterprise fund because it shows up on the monthly utility bills. Special revenue funds. That's one that we don't deal with a lot, but we do have a few of them. Bmc Road Funds is a special revenue. So BMC is state and county roads. So B roads are county roads, C roads are city roads, but the state calls them BMC roads funds. And that's the money that we get from the state based on how much they collect in gas tax. And so they classify our roads as class C roads. So that's the money we get. And we can only spend it on roads. It doesn't cover Phil's stipend or the mayor's new shoes. I'm kidding, the mayor doesn't get new shoes. I shouldn't make jokes like that in a public meeting.
Not in budget, no.
Yeah, but it's because he was lifting his foot at the time. And so I noticed his shoes. But the idea is that it's very limited on what it's collected for has to be spent on the same things. The city has kind of quasi created a special revenue fund, although it hasn't been officially created with our property tax dollars. So the roughly 2.4 million that the city gets in revenue every year, the council has said, this all goes to public safety. We will not spend it on anything else. In our city, that's easy to do because the public safety budget is more than that. And so other monies are used to pay for those unfunded portions of public safety. But that's the kind of concept, is that there's some entity out there that said this revenue source can only be spent this way. And that's kind of what creates the special revenue fund. Am I good so far, Jamie?
Yep.
Okay. I touched on debt service fund. Debt service funds are the money that's set aside to pay the bonds. North Ogden City currently has 2 bonds for the police station. And the annual payment for that is roughly $450,000 for those 2 together. Some cities, the reason they sometimes have it as a separate fund is sometimes they'll accumulate enough money, they put it into that fund and it just sits there ready to pay off debt. And so it's kind of set aside in its own little cookie jar. We don't have that situation yet. What we do is we take it from our revenues, move it into the special revenue fund, and then, or the debt service fund, and then pay it. So it's kind of a real quick step, but it still does go through the cycle. And then the last fund that I mentioned was capital project funds. So this is the money that's used for the big projects in the city. The general fund has a capital project fund that we have a balance in, and we have projects planned to use a portion of that money every year. Each enterprise fund, so water, sewer, storm, and trash, have capital projects associated with their individual funds, so they have their own separate capital projects that happen. Theirs is a little different because it's a business fund, but I just don't want you to get confused. And well, if always ask for a refresher, because it'll happen, right? Mayor.
So John, is it true that the general fund can give money to the enterprise funds for their projects? But the enterprise funds, you can't take money from that and put it in the general fund.
Most
You
of the time.
you can do a loan, but it's really funky.
Yeah, so government, the general fund can spend money on anything it wants. So we could take sales tax dollars, which is the biggest pot of general fund revenues, and spend it on all the water infrastructure we want. But if we want to take any money from water and give it to the general fund, then we do what's called an interfund loan. There are situations in state code that North Ogden City hasn't done before, at least not that I'm aware of, where you can actually, they do take it. They hold a public hearing and they say, okay, we're now converting this money to general fund money. North Ogden hasn't done that, and I'm not aware of any plans to do that. But Layton does it with their power plant every year. So they have a power service that they provide, and they used to, I should say. I'm not sure they've done it recently. What I was going to say with the capital project fund is that there does not have to be a balance in the capital project fund. North Ogden City has typically had a balance, meaning that we have projects we know that are coming. We're not doing them yet, but we have some money set aside ready to cover those. And the reason that's important, and the reason that fund ends up having a balance, is tying the capital project fund back to the general fund. The general fund has a maximum amount of money we can have in it. So for purposes of our discussion here, North Ogden City gets a $10 million in revenue to the general fund every year. We can keep up to 35% of that money in what we call fund balance, meaning we can have it there for our rainy day. That's the other thing we'll call is a rainy day fund. That number just got moved up. So it used to be 25%, and there is a minimum, but we always have to have 5% in there. But this year, I think North Ogden is at the end of fiscal was 22%, 23% was our fund balance, meaning that we had just over $2 million in our fund balance that is there for catastrophic failures in infrastructure, downturns in economy, or other things to help us get through. And basically we can get through about 4 months. If all the revenue gets shut off, then we've got enough money to get us through 4 months of expenses.
And what is the current maximum, you say?
35%. And the state just moved that up. They regulate it because there were some entities who were hoarding money, is the best way to say it. They had way more revenues than they did expenditures, and they didn't have a way to spend it. So it just grew and grew and grew. And so the state stepped in and said, no, there's a max that you can collect. So.
Are all these funds funded by property tax except for general, which is sales tax?
No. General fund, property tax funds, general fund, but only about 25% of the general fund revenues, 20 to 25%. So the other, in fact, that ties into our next discussion, which is the revenues. So I'm going to start with the enterprise funds. The money for enterprise funds come from grants, which we do get occasionally, and utility payments. So every month when you pay your utility bills, those go into the individual separated enterprise fund accounts. Water is the one that we probably collect the most from each year. Trash is actually pretty close behind, but that's not because trash has the city holds a lot of money. We spend a lot of money to make trash work with who we pay to pick it up and where we pay to dump it. And we'll get into that in a touch with expenses. But the other stuff now, where most people think again that money that the city gets is taxes, and they think that's what funds most of the city, and that is true. About 25% of our money comes from the property taxes, which is, about that $2.4 million of the 10 million that we get every year. About 45%, give or take a little bit, comes from sales tax. And sales tax comes to the city in two different ways. Well, it all comes from the state, but it's calculated in two different ways. Every dollar that each of you spend at Lee's Marketplace, $1 of every $100 you spend gets split in half. Half of it comes to the city, so we get 50 cents of every $100. The other half goes to what's called the state pool. And then the state takes all of that 50% from all of the entities across the state and looks at population and then distributes that money out. So North Ogden gets half of that dollar because it was spent at Lee's, and the other half we get because we have 22,000 residents. So a city like Riverdale gets a lot of money because of the amount of dollars spent in their city, and a very small amount of money because of the number of residents they have. So North Ogden is, what's our percentage, Jamie, on local versus, is it 60%?
Yeah, that's probably.
So 60% local spend, 40% because of the residents we have.
The last time I looked, I was 34-66.
Yeah. And that's, we've actually been very lucky with the way they did online sales and Amazon. Every time you have an Amazon package delivered to your house, they count the delivery as the point of sale. If that hadn't happened, right now, of the money we were spent, 66% of the Amazon taxes would be going outside of the city. Instead of the 30% that we, anyway, so we get, so not saying buy Amazon, I'm just saying that the state did us a really good favor, and really across the nation it changed about 4 years ago, where they just said, look, we're going to hit everyone with paying online taxes. So there's no way to avoid it anymore. And it's been huge for the COVID pandemic because it kept all the dollars accessible to local governments. And in fact, in some ways, it's really helped because cities like us, where there's a lot more Amazon vans driving around than maybe some other cities, it's really benefited us with a little bit of a surge in sales. So I've talked about property tax and sales taxes revenues in the general fund. There's also franchise taxes. So when you pay your Comcast, your CenturyLink, your telecommunication bills, there's usually a franchise tax tacked on there, and we get that money. So that comes to North Ogden City, and that's about $1 million a year. And then there's the money we talked about, the Bmc Road Funds comes in. That's about 800,000 this last year. What does that get us up to, Jamie?
About 950, so yeah, so that's what, 7?
7?
Wait, 7 or 8?
Yeah, and yeah, that's the gas tax dollars, the Bmc. And then what revenues am I missing now, Jamie, for general fund? There's some intergovernmental stuff. A good example is Weaver School District pays us some money for having an officer at the junior high. Tracy goes up there and works, or Officer Priest goes up there and works at the school, and we get money from them. There's other grants. There's
Lots of grant money. A lot of that is for the public safety. And what else?
So this is where you get into the object lesson.
Right.
There's this mixed pot, and it's not always the same mix every year, but there's some general rules that we can typically plan on. The only
Building permits.
building permits and other fines and speeding tickets, for example. Now, since we're talking about speeding tickets, another caveat, the speeding ticket revenue that the city gets, about 85% of that money goes to the state, and the city keeps about 15% of the money. And that 15% of the money typically goes to cover the court costs. If you look at it, it comes in at about enough money to cover how much it costs to run the court. And so there are places you've heard of where they call them ticket factories. I don't want to call anyone out on YouTube, but you all know of one where it's a speed trap and you don't go through at a high speed because that's how they fund the city. Or at least that's the accusation people make. But they do that, and they're only getting 50% of that money too. So really, the state gets a good chunk of that. But then the state does provide services that the city doesn't with big circuit courts and things like that. Not circuit courts.
That 15% is across the board throughout the entire state. Any city gives a speeding ticket, they get 15% of it. Okay.
Correct, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And so those are the type of revenues that come in the general fund. Those are the type of revenues that come into the enterprise funds. We talked about utility billing. The only one we haven't really talked about is fees for services. So there's recreation fees, where someone gives us money and we're giving them a very specific service back. The best example of the city is the aquatic center. To get into the aquatic center, you pay a price at the door and you get in, right? And so that money goes to help keep the aquatic center going. But and we haven't talked about the aquatic center, but that's almost, we treat that like an enterprise fund. So its revenues stay there. And then for the most of the time it's been in service, the city has subsidized that with some general fund money. 1 year we made money. Jamie's nodding. Last year we almost broke even.
Mhm.
So a good example is this might be one of those funds that this group will want to talk about in a future meeting where we can talk about the details of how that operates, what the injection from the city is to help make that run and how that all operates. The last thing to probably talk about in this group is expenses. And then once I'm done with this, then let's just talk about ideas and things and questions. In fact, if anyone, like I said, if you have a question, stop me now because I don't love to talk all the time, although some people might argue against that. These are just, yeah.
You might want to touch on the allocation of administrative costs to those enterprise funds. So that they understand what that line item is. It's fairly significant.
Is that the admin fee offset? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so everyone who works for the city that's in this room, Bryce, Jamie, and myself, perform services that benefit those business-related activities. And the general fund, if the council wanted to, could just say, well, that's the general fund's going to pay for it. This goes back into the mayor's comment about we can give money to the enterprise entities, but they can't give it back to us unless there's a logical reason. In our city currently, each individual enterprise fund pays for a portion of my salary and Jamie's salary and Bryce's salary. And there's a zillion others, the engineer's salary, not a zillion, but we have 83 employees. So there's a good portion of them who are general fund employees that there's some sort of money that's paid to them. In fact, a good example, one I didn't mention is there's a motor pool fund or a motor pool exchange between where we've got a almost like a separate little shop, right? We call it the motor pool fund and we pay a lot of expenses out of there. But water will bring their truck in and if it breaks and the motor pool guys will fix it. Or the sewer truck will break and the motor pool guys will fix it, or the police vehicles will break. And so we treat that like a little separate business. And that's what you see that motor pool expense all across the lines. That's the transfer from those groups to the motor pool fund to make sure that we're covering expenses, everything from fuel to repairs to salaries. And so that's something that we do. And that admin transfer has grown over the years as we've tried to better understand it. It's a number that is designed to recoup the cost to the general fund expenses through the utility fund, so that there's not money being given over there. And it has grown. I mean, it's a pretty large number, 600
Or better, yeah.
or better. And when it was first started, we implemented about 10 years ago, it was 0. So to put that in perspective, then that means there would have been 600,000 more in the general fund that would be needed right now to cover those expenses that the utility is helping pay for. The flip side is, and that's what I'm sure that we'll talk about in this group, is that also means that enterprise fees have gone up instead of taxes. So residents are still putting the bill for those. It's coming out in an increased monthly fee as opposed to an annual tax. So it's not like the money's getting magic created somewhere. It's still coming out of residents' pockets, right? So, let's see.
So when our trash bill goes up, not all of it is going to collect the trash. Some of it is going to this admin fund.
There's a portion of your trash bill every month that goes to the admin fund. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And in fact, expenses is the next thing to talk about. And these expenses are across all the funds that we have. And it's not that they're all shared, but each fund has an expense of this type. The biggest expenses in the general fund are salaries and benefits for employees. So that makes up 65% of our expenses. We are a service industry, meaning we provide services. And so we don't have a lot of payment for other activities. The flip side of that would be the sewer fund, or sorry, the solid waste fund. The solid waste fund is actually still a service activity, but we rely on an outside contractor to provide the majority of the services. So the city generated salary and benefits is fairly small compared to how much we generate every year. Because we then contract with Republic Services to haul it all at about $550,000 to $600,000 a year right now. And then Weaver County to take the trash where we dump it. And so we're spending $1 million a year with outside contractors, for lack of a better word. When the fund is costing the city about 1.3 million. So like there's $300,000 in other expenses and $1 million in outside expenses. So again, salaries, benefits. This intergovernmental term comes up a little bit. You could argue that the money to the county to dump it is an intergovernmental payment because we're paying the county, another organization. But there are places that pay Republic Services because they own dumps. So they'll pay them to pick it up, they'll pay them to dump it. And so it's a private entity. So we don't necessarily call this an intergovernment revenue or an intergovernment expense because it's going to an enterprise activity that the county is providing. Right, Jamie?
Right.
Someday Jamie's gonna say, no, you're wrong, John. And that's okay.
You're wrong, John.
What?
I said you're wrong, John.
Okay. Then we've got department supplies, which is the stuff you typically think of, paper, gasoline, all that kind of stuff. Professional expenses, the outside contractor expenses. And then I put computers and software and subscriptions like that in a separate category because every one of our entities or every one of our operating groups has a different software package they deal with. Jamie's group works with Cassell. It's a accounting software specific to government. It focuses on the way government uses it, but it's expensive. $6,000 a year for the base price, and then you got modules. What's our total spend
About
on that?
15.
15 grand a year to get the software.
Oh.
Those,
Spread that across all.
and then that becomes part of that admin transfer fee. So water pays a little bit of that because they have to pay for Jamie's group to run the finances, and they have to. And Cassell and Bryce uses the Cassell, and so water pays for a bit of that because Bryce's group is the one who does the utility billing and brings the revenue into the city. So there's logic to the way things happen, but it's very complicated. It's like this bucket here of Skittles and M&Ms and Reese's Pieces. The nice thing is that there is a transparency required in government that isn't required in business, right? So everything's available, everything's inspectable. Most of you got a copy of the city's actual budget. That's a line by line, what the city spends. You can see what we spent in the past, what we're planning this year, where we're at. It's just it's meant to be a very open process, and this group is part of that process, right? That's the reason the council is behind this. Yeah, Chris.
So when you're talking about the buckets, I mean, is it literally physically a separate account for everything to keep the dollars clean, or is it something, or is it just accounting that keeps it clean?
It is commingled at the bank.
Okay.
So all our money is mixed in the same bank accounts that we have. But there's a spreadsheet and the Cassell software that makes it very clear, this much belongs to this group, this much belongs to this group. One thing that's probably important to mention is the city keeps very little cash in a low yield checking account, right? Because as you all know, checking accounts probably generate the least amount of interest unless you get a very favorable deal where you go. But the city is also heavily restricted on how we can spend or how we can save our money. I know that sounds funny, but Bryce can tell you, we for years and years and years have only put our money in the public treasurer investment fund at the state. So the state was our bank and they invested our money very wisely and prudently. Because several years ago, 25, I don't know, doesn't matter when.
2008.
2008, there were cities, it's only 15 years. There were cities who were making unwise investments and the market crashed and they lost their portfolios. And not lost, but significantly reduced. And so treasurers and finance directors were in lots of trouble. So then the state put in some rules and said, this is the only way you can spend money. So for years and years, we only did PTIF. Sorry, that's an acronym, Public Treasury Investment Fund, but that's what it is. It's a state account. But we have started buying US Treasury bonds with Bryce and the mayor taking the lead on that. And we've actually have some more interest, although even, so we're getting 4.5% on our latest purchase.
Yeah.
Of treasury bonds, and the PTIF account 8 years ago was getting us like less than 1% of interest. Of course, bonds at the time were getting us less than 2% of interest, but now the PTIF account is 3% interest or close to it. And so we're subject to market forces. In fact, I didn't list that as one of our revenues as interest. I did list it here, I just didn't say it out loud.
Well, the other night when we looked at it, the interest revenues were something like 700% of what we budgeted because of all this.
Yeah.
And,
And the city is subject to market and subject to how things go and flow, which is part of the reason the state says, well, we're going to force you into very conservative investments so that the city doesn't make or break based on how the stock market does. But then the flip side is that means that sometimes we don't get the value out of our holdings that people feel like we should. One thing that's important to mention is the city is a very large company. And the reason I say that is most people think of it's a small city, it's a North Ogden city. Well, the stuff that this group is going to be talking about is almost $30 million a year of money moving around. So it's a lot of money moving around. And the city, according to our last financial statements, we have assets of $135 million. So that means Mayor Berube is in charge of a board of a company that owns $135 million worth of stuff. And that is in roads and pipes and things that aren't going to move. They're not going to run off. But a good example is we buy pieces of equipment that are very expensive. Our Vector truck, which is a truck that we use to clean the sewer out, and then we have a separate one, it's not the same one, that cleans out the storm drain. And they're $400,000 to $500,000 depending on what you get. And they're good for 7 to 10 years. But we have to have them. So some places where we have to have those things, we survive because of the monthly bills. And that's why monthly bills creep up. Is the Vector truck, when I started here 10 years ago, I think our first one was 250 grand. And the last one we bought was 400 and something. And so things go up, they're very expensive. But like the EPA, stormwater is a good example. We have to do it. The clean water folks at the state and the EPA come and say, North Ogden, you have to do this, and we can't say no. We can. But the fines will be more expensive than the equipment. So, what else was kind of a heads up?
John, while you're looking, I think that's important because oftentimes in County Swanton can testify to this. Sometimes the state gives us unfunded mandates. They're saying as a city, you have to do this and you figure out how to come up with the money. And we have no choice. Sometimes they come up with things and they do fund it. but there's a lot of unfunded mandates. You know, they talk about cutting taxes at the state, and then they dump that on the cities who have to increase taxes. So the city gets all the negative and the legislature gets all the positive, right? But when they cut taxes, oftentimes it ends up being a cost to the cities. Is that true, Councilmember Swanson? You've been around a long time.
Unfortunately, yes, it is. What was that?
We don't see the state tax decreases. I don't see any percentage increase or anything from the state.
Haven't you read the headline? Come on. It's in the paper. It must be true.
And so this is probably, you know, we're getting to the end of what I had planned, and so I think I don't know what the group has planned, or sorry, I don't have anything planned. But it might be a good time to start talking about what are your goals, how are the things that we can help you with. I mean, a good example, we talked about one, the aquatic center. That's probably something this group will want to delve into. And it's okay to ask questions about how can we raise revenues, how can we cut costs, how can we do whatever, you know, yeah, Mayor.
Have you talked about RDA funds?
No, that I missed that off my list.
I
Okay,
interject, but just wanted to make sure we were covering everything.
okay. So the RDA fund,
Call it out.
redevelopment agency.
Okay.
It gets worse with this one, Randy. So we have a redevelopment agency, an RDA agency, RD agency, whatever. We call it the RDA fund. It gets convoluted because there's a community development area that's managed by the redevelopment agency as well as a redevelopment area. And so sometimes we say RDA meaning the agency, and sometimes we say RDA meaning the area.
Area meaning like a physical piece of property.
Physical piece of property. And the community development area and the redevelopment area, if you look at them on Washington Boulevard, they look like teeth. So it is from 2700 to 1500 along Washington Boulevard. And a property is typically either in the RDA, the redevelopment area, or the CDA. But they can't be in both. That's a rule. But in those areas, the redevelopment agency gets some revenue from what they call the tax increment, meaning the increase in tax dollars generated from those properties from when they were initially put in the area. So a good example is the Smith's Marketplace building that was here was in the redevelopment area. It used to be an empty field. It was alfalfa. So when it came in and was built out and there was millions of dollars poured into a building and millions of dollars of tax revenue or tax revenue every year, well, sorry, tax value added, the county then started collecting on behalf of all the taxing entities much more property tax for that parcel. They then divided that property tax up, and the redevelopment agency got roughly 50% of the increase in tax dollars. So as an alfalfa field, they're paying $10,000 a year roughly. As a Smith's Marketplace, they're paying $300,000 a year. So the redevelopment area gets $140,000 of tax revenue that then has to be spent back into the area in improvements to make that area either get out of blight or create economic benefit to the city. Yeah, Mayor.
John, the reason I brought that up is I think this group needs to understand that the aquatic center is in that RDA area. And we have, I think it's by the end of this year, have to have a plan on how we're going to spend this money that's accumulated over the years, $2.5 million. And I believe none of us were around at the time. I don't believe, but some of the intention of that was to use that to upgrade or make sure that the aquatic center is properly maintained. We're about 20 years now, and it's to the point we're going to have to look at that and say, okay, what type of renovations or maintenance do we need to do to keep that, going?
Yeah.
So that's that's the money that's kind of out there for the RDA fund, and I think it would be well for this group to understand, when you look at that capital projects fund, the city has commitments, quite a few commitments that have accumulated over time that we're responsible to fund. An example would be senior center parking lot right across the street. When there was an agreement made on the library, the city committed to pave that parking lot as excess parking. That's about $400,000 that the city has to pay that was previously committed. Now another commitment for about 1.2 million, do we think, John, now?
Yeah,
There's a park that's going to be going in down here at Patriot Point. The city's obligated to put that park in by agreement, about $1.2 million. There's other commitments. You look at our park equipment, average life on that's about 15 years. We're about 24 to 28 years now. So we have commitments to make sure those parks are maintained properly, in addition to planning for additional parks as the city grows. So I think you need to keep that in mind as you look and say, okay, how's the city planning for these things in the future? John didn't talk about impact fees, did you, John?
no, not yet, no.
Okay.
Before you get to that, does everybody understand the tax increment on the RDAs? That isn't tax increment to North Ogden, an extra 300,000 to us that then gets cut in half and half of it's put into the RDA. It's agreements with the school district, with the fire district, with all the other taxing entities that are on your tax bill. We negotiate with them and they say, okay, last year we got $10, this year we're going to get $100. We'll give you 40 of that additional 90 and we're going to keep 50. And we'll do that for the next 20 years, 22 years or whatever. So it's these other taxing entities that are also getting more money because of the Smith's Marketplace. But they're giving a share of that to us that we can use to help redevelop that, because when it's redeveloped and brings in more tax dollars, they do well, right? They get more tax money. We get more tax money for a period of time. And with the RDA, the redevelopment agency, our area expiring this year, the monies that have been that shared portion of those tax revenues will go away, and those other entities will then keep 100% of what they would have normally been getting. We won't get that any longer, but the monies that we've accrued, we can still use and plan. It carries over. Well, we have, I think it's 3 years.
That's the $2.5 million.
Right.
And we have, by the end of this year, we have to have a very specific plan on how we're going to spend it.
And then we have a short period of time, I think it's 3 or 5 years, something like that, to actually spend that money.
And we have been spending that as it's gone along. So
Yeah.
the Acres Market, for those of you who remember Acres Market, which is what Lee's is now, was redeveloped by the city with this money years ago, which has then resulted in the reinvestment in the area to get it up to where it is now. So probably across the 20, I think it is 22 years that it's been active, we have collected, I want to say $8 million in this increment money that has been reinvested back into the hard infrastructure in that area. And so there's 2.5 left to spend that we're talking about.
So is there a window here again? Or a standard window? For example, they put in Smith's, more taxes coming in, certain amount of time that money comes in before it's spent. Is it like the 3-year window that the RCA, RDA or whatever, and RDA is collecting, and then it's done?
It starts from the creation of the redevelopment area.
Okay.
So that's what starts the time clock.
Okay.
And then when you get to the end of the 22 years, it doesn't matter if a building was built year 1 or year 20, everything stops at year 22.
Okay.
So Smith's will stop paying increment to the redevelopment agency when it hits year 22.
So the same thing with Lee's over here, it's 22-year window, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
And that's why we created the CDA, one, because the state, if I remember right, they eliminated the creation of RDAs, redevelopment areas. Now they call them community development areas. And we started the CDA 3 years ago, John,
we pulled the trigger on it, yes, in 2019.
2019. So that new 22-year period starts. Does that make sense?
Okay.
With the CDA that's ending with the RDA.
And those are different properties.
Different
so-
properties, though, okay.
The old, where Ace Hardware is in the strip mall is in the community development area, not in the redevelopment area. So the money invested there will be good for 22 years, 25 years. I think the CDA is a 25-year program. But so it's weird, and the state keeps changing the rules on it. They now call them community investment areas. They're not even CDAs anymore. So they keep changing. The nice thing is you're locked into the rule when it was implemented because it's tied to taxes, and so the state does not interact with that. So the CDA rules will not change until it's done, unless the city and the taxing entities agree to a change. So, yeah, Brenda.
So when I ask this question, you're gonna see how much I do not know. We have the RDA started 22 years ago, it ends this year. So RDA is done, there's no more RDA, right?
Correct.
Can the city start another RDA?
Yes, they would have to call it the community investment area.
So the RDA started 22 years ago, community one started 3 years ago. But they're basically the same thing as far as tax entities?
It's the same concept, it's different property.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so, but the city does have the option of putting that, the land that's expiring out with the RDA into a new thing if they would like to. But we haven't had that discussion yet. It oftentimes is pretty hard, and what it does is it resets the bar. So we would not get that increment from Smith's anymore, because it's now the base level of tax, and so you only get the increased value. So the 300,000 would be the new floor for taxes, and we would only get the value above that was based on investment in the property.
So in 27 years, when this CDA that we have now is finished, do we do another one?
We'd have that option in that timeframe, yeah.
Okay,
One more question on
Yeah,
that.
no,
Okay,
this is the key question and answer part.
Okay, cool. So, all right, you said after the 22-year on an RDA, after 22-year period, those taxes then go where?
Back to the school district, the fire district,
Okay,
all those other entities that are showing up on your tax bill.
okay, okay,
So they've given us half of their money, let's just call it half, because it varies by entity. But they get their 50% back when it expires.
okay.
Yeah, Brandon.
Kind of a functional question. When you go to build a budget for next fiscal year, do the department heads then submit what they want to have on their new budgets? Is that how you gather the initial starting points? And
Well, so Jamie, why don't you explain a little bit about that process? I didn't warn Jamie, but Jamie is the one who manages that process for the city. And she is vital to this whole discussion, so I don't want to just ignore her.
You're not ignoring me. You're doing great.
Okay, Jamie wants me to answer this question. So the majority of the way it happens for the purpose of this group is we look at what happened last year,
who's we?
the whole
Department
city,
heads?
everybody, so council and department heads. And then the department heads take what we call the yellow sheets. And it's like the documents you've seen where it says this GL account is spending $4,000 on office supplies. The difference with the yellow sheets is there's a little more detail there. We'll say, hey, 500 of that's for paper and 1,000 of it's for envelopes and this much is for, and so we call them the yellow sheets, and those, we will make those available to this group as well. So that you can see them. But in fact, that's really what we're going to be talking about when you have questions, is what's on the yellow sheets. And so it usually comes in as a request from department heads. And then Jamie and me and the mayor and Phil trim and cut and squish and move And then it goes to the council with the administration of the city has done as much as we can to make some judgment calls, and now it's up to the council to make policy decisions. I haven't seen a situation where we were able to present the council a budget that did not require additional revenues. And so I'm not saying a budget that isn't balanced, because we're required to present a budget that's balanced. It just is usually some sort of movement of the money around to make it balance.
In the past, the council has asked the city government to reduce and to go into a saving mode. And so you've taken those yellow sheets and you've cut down from there. Is that how that's?
Yeah, so last year, the way it happened, for example, is the council said, no, we need you to scale things back, and here's some general policy decisions. So last year, we scraped a lot of the training budget out. We said, if it's not required for you, so like for our water operators, they're required to get continuing education classes every year, so we have to pay for that. So they kept their budget, but for our administrative front office staff, there's not a requirement for them. And so we haven't been paying for the same type of training at the same level that we would have done in the past. A good example is the planning commission. We've done all of our training with the planning commission in-house for free, where sometimes in years past, we've been able to pay for them to attend a conference where they can get their training, because they're required to get some training, but it's not the same level of that, like the water operators need a specific instructor to give them the training. So we've scaled some stuff back. The other thing we've done is we've started specifically saving more money for capital. In a lot of ways, we used to kind of we would, by the end of the year, get more money in revenues, usually from sales tax and fees for services, and underspend. And so we ended up with a surplus, and we just put that in capital projects or into the fund balance. And the council is being more methodical about, we're saving this much money because we have these things coming. And so we're doing kind of a long-term plan. Yeah. Remind me of your name, sorry.
Steve,
Okay.
Weaver School District, you said that they're going to get RDA, this tax money back, 50% of that, you say they're going to get it back. Is that starting this year, you say, or?
It'll
started or what?
It'll be, so we still got it for this fiscal year, but next fiscal year, we won't get it.
Right. Well, they turn around and so they're gonna get that extra income because they have been given to us, North Alton. They're gonna get it now. Are they gonna turn around and say, okay, reduce their requirements for our property taxes? Are they gonna reduce that?
They never do, but here's the other thing they're doing. Is they're consistently giving up tax revenue to things like, for instance, Ogden City.
Well, see, Ogden City's a separate district. They have nothing to do with it.
Hold on. Ogden City, the airport out there, which they say benefits the county because it brings economic things into the county. So they go to the school districts and say, hey, we want to improve the airport. And to do that, we need you to give up 50% of the tax that you would get. They came to the sewer district and wanted us to give up 95% of what we would normally collect from them, so they can use that to redevelop the airport. So what happens is all these different projects that are going on in the county, they go to the sewer district, they go to the school district, and they say, hey, this is beneficial to the county. Will you give up some of the tax you collect so we can use it? So they get this money and then they give it away on this hand. So I would say, if I was a betting man, no, they will never reduce their taxes.
They'll just find places to spend.
Well, they're either
Projects.
helping, they're either having people come to them and say, we need you to give us up this tax that you would normally get if we do this development, or they find a place to spend it.
All right. I went to the meeting Wednesday. Dr. Peterson's the chief financial officer for the Weaver School District. And I found out that, of course, Ogden City's got their own separate school district, period.
Yeah, Weaver County.
They are supposed to be self-reliant themselves. you know, and get Weaver County stuff. And so there's 15 school districts. And we found out, Dr. Stevens said, we are number 14 as far as total expenditures in the county. Guess who the 15th school district is? Salt Lake City, because they got so much other revenue, base of income taxes and all that stuff they use to help support their school system. We're number 14, which that's good. Roy is like number 2 or 3, you know, that area. And I couldn't believe it. And I said, gee, that's pretty good. Sound like, you know, they were doing real well with what they're, you know, doing with their money, being number 14 in expenditures. But now that you're saying they're going to use that, I hope we go back to Dr. Stevens says, listen, you got.
There's two things on your property tax bill, if you look at it.
Yeah.
One is they have all the capital expenditures they're bonding for, all these new schools they're building. They come to you, they came to the city and said, you know, hey, we want to build these schools, will you support this? So what's happening, we've had such growth in the state, and you know, building all these new schools and renovating, and so if you look at your property tax bill, there's really 2 line items, as I recall, there are 3. There's at least 2, and one of them's to cover their bonding. You know, which because the superintendent came here and told us school districts never raise their taxes. Remember that?
I do.
Which I thought, well, what have I missed here? Because every year it goes up, but I doubt if you'll ever see a reduction in taxes from the school district.
This guy had a question. I forgot. What was your name?
Yeah, my name's Nate.
Nate.
Just
Okay.
have a quick question. It's not related to this though, so if
Oh,
you guys
okay.
are still having this discussion, it's fine, but. Okay, it was actually on the capital expenditures fund you were just talking about. So you said we have stuff in the future we have to pay for. Do we have a list of that and everything that's easily accessible that we can see? I'm guessing you have that. And then the second question is with that is the capital expenditures fund have like rules behind it? Like you have to spend it on this project or this project? And is it kind of those things where we said enterprise can't go out, but can capital expenditure go to the fund you were talking about and vice versa pretty freely?
Not for so general fund money, which would
Yeah.
include what we typically call the capital
Okay.
improvement fund, can go anywhere in the city, including to the enterprise.
Okay.
But each enterprise has a capital expenditure almost every year that can only come over with a very specific process, and we've never done it. I don't anticipate we will do it.
Yeah, okay.
But the idea is that capital money is for those big projects. When you see excavators and stuff, that's the capital improvement money.
Okay, I just wonder if there's like rules behind it, like, hey, like, I do HOA budget, right? And it's the bylaws are very, very specific. You can only pull it out for X, Y, and Z. So I just wonder.
Once again, in answer to the kind of budget question that was asked earlier, how this all fits together. The council was a year before, it was last year. We basically said, okay, this money that's going into the excess revenues over expenses to plan for the future would be used. 10%, I think, correct me if I'm, again on this, Jamie, would be used to maintain buildings we have. Because there's really never been kind of a set aside for maintaining all the buildings we have in the city. You know, the senior citizens, this one, public safety, parks. You know, those things need maintenance, right? And you don't want to all of a sudden get hit with that. 20%, I think, was set aside for keep our parks up and going. So that we don't have equipment that's 28 years old and all of a sudden, all in, you know, a year or two, everything comes up and we have to pay for it. So we're saying, let's just keep those things up, because frankly, what we found is you kick things down the road, it costs you a lot more than if you just did it when it was due, right?
Yeah.
You know, you call it expense avoidance, but it really ends up costing you more in the long run. The remaining balance that goes in there was for future planning of parks as the city grows. So that was the breakdown on that. And we started with revenues. Once again, Councilman Swanson, correct me if I'm wrong here. We said, okay, we're gonna start with property tax being maintained. And what we'll do is we'll budget sales tax increases equal to the CPI. So last year we started and said, okay. Social Security got about it was about a 7% increase at the time of inflation. So we said, we're going to budget sales tax at 7% increase. That has to cover all the expenses. Well, at the end of the day, when we found out what was happening, public safety salaries and all these other commitments, that's when we had to go in and make the adjustment to property taxes. Now, Councilman Swanson and myself are blown away because sales tax, we're pretty conservative. We budgeted sales tax to be equal to what we collected last year. Well, it just keeps going like this. But we don't want to be caught when a recession hits, right? And all of a sudden we've made all these commitments and sales tax doesn't come in because the recession hits us. So we've been very conservative, but sales tax just continues to outpace our estimate. So that's where we started with revenues, is holding property taxes flat and budgeting a sales tax equal to what we collected in the prior year. But didn't work out.
Well, and something to consider as you think about the budget. We have 9.5, 9.8 in general fund revenue, roughly. How much of that is property tax?
2.4.
2.4. Okay, how much does the police department cost us?
About half the budget.
4.1, right?
Yeah.
So property taxes it covers 55-60% of just maintaining the police department. So if you look at the police department, 4.1, and then we have in other salaries and benefits throughout the city is another 2.1, 2.2. So between the police department and the other non-police department salaries and benefits, we're at about 6.3, $6.4 million of the 9.5 that we bring in general fund. So when you're thinking, okay, we have $10 million that we're playing with here, 9.5, we're really not, right? Because we're already committed 6.5-ish just for our public safety and our basic employees' salaries and benefits. Before we start looking at new Vector trucks, new equipment, and all of those other things, and all the other committed expenses that we have in the end, when you really boil it down at the end of each budget season, council's looking at around $1.5 million that we're playing with.
So question on that,
Yeah.
just because I just begged to first more questions was,
Sure.
so do we have like you think of Vector trucks, we know it's a big purchase, or even you said the 10% like upkeep of buildings. Do we have like a 5-year, 6-year plan that we know that
We do.
okay, so this year we're doing the roofs, this year we're doing the siding or the brickwork, or we have a Vector truck coming up in this many years down the road, so we're putting away.
Yeah,
So we got a forecast as well.
One of the additional costs is depreciation, where we're saying.
Right.
Tractor truck, $500,000, it's good for 10 years. We need to be putting $50,000 a year away for the replacement of that truck. But then we also have police vehicles and we have backhoes and all the other trucks.
Forecast as well.
Yes, right.
Okay, I just want to know, it's always good too. To know exactly.
The big part of our,
Last few years, that's not been done for the length of the city. That's just been something that was started 5 years ago. 8 years ago.
A
So-
good example is like building repairs and stuff. It would just be this year, this building needs a new roof, so we're gonna budget for it.
Right.
There wasn't any sort of hey, in 5 years, this building's gonna need a new roof.
Well, what you're getting to is there was depreciation, but it was unfunded depreciation.
yeah, which is wonderful.
And we're not doing that anymore.
Which I like, definitely. I like that.
We stopped that 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing too, that is it's really been difficult. With the accelerated growth that took place during the pandemic with low interest rates, I mean, the city grew substantially quicker. So think about this. And Councilman Swanson, correct me if I'm wrong here, but our snow plows some of them are on their last leg.
Yeah.
But we keep adding all these streets, right? So you have to make the decision, okay, when do you pull the trigger? Do you wait? You get ahead of infrastructure? Because in my opinion, once you get behind infrastructure, it's very difficult to catch up. So we have to look and say, okay,
You got a budget.
do we pull the trigger now for a snowplow, or do we keep going with 22-year-old snowplows that we don't know if they're gonna work or not work? So there's some complexity in making these decisions, but Jamie will tell you, you just can't squirrel away this money without a plan to spend it. For instance, I think it's important for you to know that even though we could have 35% in a rainy day fund in the general fund, with this year, we're gonna be what, 20, if the council decides to leave it at 22? 22% or
It was
23?
26, I believe that.
26, it was 15, and the council made a commitment to bring that back up into the 20%, but it depends on how much the council decides to transfer over to capital projects.
Yeah, you gotta transfer some of them.
You know, because we've got a plan for the future needs of the city. And that's where it becomes a little bit scientific, I guess, you know, it's complex, but I just want to let you know, we're not squirreling away money.
It's for purposes.
It's for purposes. For instance, this public safety building out here. You know, we bonded for that, I think at 1.99% for the first 6.5 million. And what was the second?
2.9 something, just under 3.
Yeah. So had we not been able to have some funding to do that, now people might say, well, why are you building that? Well, you can ask yourself the question, if we're really going to grow to 40,000 people in the city, when do you pull the trigger? Because there is such a demand for public safety, police officers right now, first responders.
How many personnel, how many public safety personnel do we have?
22 sworn officers.
22 sworn officers. So we have 1 officer per 1,000 residents. The national average is 2.4.
Okay.
Ogden City's 2.1, but that's what we have to look at. If we're gonna grow to 40,000 and we're gonna have all of this high density housing that the state's requiring, we're not gonna be able to stay at. You know, so we have to look ahead and say, okay, when do we pull that trigger? So we made the decision to move now, when rates were cheap, costs were high, but I don't see them going down a great deal either. So there's some things you have to look at as you look at this budget. Plan for the future. That's one of the things we've got to do if we're going to go to 40,000.
And some estimates have that we'll grow to 50,000. If you look at the Kempsey Gardner and some of the stuff that Weaver County is looking at, they're suggesting that North Ogden City could be closer to 50,000 people once it's completely built up.
Okay, so on that note, and just kind of getting off track a little bit. So you'd mentioned at a previous council meeting that there's a lot of pressure coming from the state to have moderate income housing here. What does that pressure actually entail? Is it you do this or we're going to fine you, or?
Well,
We'll see what happens by the end of this session.
yeah, there was actually discussion of taking zoning
Completely away.
away from the cities,
Right.
letting the state zone, because they wanted higher density than perhaps cities were willing to let them have, but.
Right.
So right now, they first started talking about, well, we might not just give your share of the sales tax if you don't qualify. Then if
Or
they're
the road
wrong,
funds.
then we'll go to Bmc Road Funds, we'll hold that back, which by the way, if you've driven our streets, I think we had what did we do, John, 5 years ago, have a study that said it'd take about 10 million to get streets where they were needed to
A
be.
little longer than that, maybe 7 years.
So it's probably 20 million now is my point.
Yeah.
For roads, but now what they've settled on is if you don't qualify with your, what do they call it? It's not affordable, it's
Moderate income housing.
moderate income housing.
What constitutes moderate income?
They have 30% of AMI, 50%, 80%, average median
income for your area,
Okay.
area median income.
We were one of 17 cities whose moderate income housing plan was approved.
On the first try.
Statewide.
First try.
Out of the total
200 and something.
200 and something.
So 90 were required to submit.
But there's 240 cities in the state, but 90.
Yeah,
So
90.
we were- We were one of them, but now what they're saying is, okay, if you don't comply, we're gonna fine you $250 a day. $250 a day that you have to pay into the Olin Walker
Moderate
housing
income housing fund.
But ultimately, we think they're just gonna march down the road to where they feel like they can zone and tell you how much you have to have in high density.
Mhm.
Because there's some cities like Plain City, they're saying 3/4 of an acre lot, that's it.
Wow.
So they're punishing everybody for cities who won't look at moderate.
And I don't want to talk about this right now, but who is pressuring the state to pressure the cities? That I don't.
Well, I can tell you that, look who's in the leadership of the state. Stuart Adams and
Brad
Brad
Wilson.
Wilson.
Brad Wilson, they're
Wilson.
both developers, Mike Schultz, who's the majority leader. All of them.
Hey, speaking of when to pull the trigger, I think it's my uncomfortable responsibility to observe that we've been here for an hour and a quarter. And the old saying that the mind can only endure what the rear end can endure. Philosophy.
So
I'm not trying to cut you off.
no, so I'm done. So the goals I would think for this committee moving forward, and I think it dovetails into this next area that I think you're going into, Doug, which is future meeting, is we as staff envision this of being this group saying, we want to talk about this at our next meeting. And it would be very helpful to get questions so we know what information to bring. If the group wants to approach it as a Q&A, we can do that where Jamie and me and Phil can respond as we can. It just might not be as effective or as deep a dive as some of you want to do. So if you want to say, hey, let's focus on aquatic center on this meeting, then we'll come prepared to talk about aquatic center and get you the information so you can look in the yellow sheets and do the deep dive that you want to do. But we want to leave it up to you so that we can be responsive to what this committee needs.
When do the yellow sheets, when do you produce those?
So we're working on them right now. They're not finalized yet. So they're not.
They would be a good working document for this committee to have. How soon could they be available?
So we can give you the draft. I mean, I think that's kind of the,
Yeah, we don't want to get the final, we want to be part of the
well,
final.
no, and I think that's what I'm gonna say is that's part of what I think the group wanted to be involved in is what are the decisions? The one thing I would caution you, based on my experience with past councils, not the current one, is we had past councils that would look at 100% increase in something and be very upset when we were talking about $50 and ignore a 10% increase on something that was 5,000. And so one thing that might be helpful to focus on is I mean, the group can do whatever you want. I'm just saying, if you focus on the big pieces first, or if that's where the majority of our time can be spent, and we're probably going to be able to find the $50 in that $5,000 decision a lot of times. So
I think it will be helpful also for discussion purposes if we have some projected revenue numbers. It's hard to budget when you don't have any idea how much money you're gonna have to spend.
Revenues are always first.
So that will be part of this, a necessary part of this conversation, that if we're looking at making some assumptions that property tax increase might be this much, and we're going to do this or this with property, not property taxes, sales taxes will grow by this much. You know, which is property taxes, franchise fees, those things, which is about 75% of the budget. That will grow by X amount. Property taxes, we know, are completely eaten up by the police department, plus another 40% that comes out of property sales taxes. Knowing what those projected numbers are will help us then start working towards what can we really do, what really can be done.
My observation has been, the council,
and the mayor took a lot of heat at the meeting last summer. But what you've seen by being described is they're trying to show courageous leadership to look forward to our city, and that's why they took that heat and still decided they had to move ahead with some decisions, but we can help with that, be on the helpful side this year.
And I guess we, done out of bounds stuff. I mean, because I was just brainstorming, and one of my brainstorms, because my son is just joining the Weaver County Sheriff's Department, is do we push off some of the police department to Weaver County? I know that, I'm sure that's been pros and cons done of.
We had a long discussion about that. It comes down to what level of service.
Right,
the
but
citizens want.
I guess my point is that how far out of the bounds do we start thinking, or do we keep it kind of focused and?
Well, and the other thing, that discussion is pretty much over. We're
No.
committed. Yeah.
I'm thinking, how far out of bounds are we thinking?
Chris, I don't think there's anything really out of bounds, idea wise. I think, you probably need to focus on material things that can make a difference.
Right, and that's
Get
what,
down the weeds, but here's what I think the question you need to ask when you start thinking what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. What do the citizens of this community expect? Because we did take a lot of heat when we did go to the sheriff's office. But our investigation showed that the level of service, because policing a county versus policing a city is substantially different. The sheriff's office isn't gonna go to a call when somebody calls and says, my cat's stuck in the chimney, so to speak.
Or I lock myself out of my
Or I
car.
locked myself out of the car. They're not responding to that. So when you start thinking of things, keep in mind, what level of service do North Ogden residents expect? Because we're pretty spoiled here, frankly. But that's what makes our city great, right? Is you have some unique things, but always ask yourself, because you can cut the heck out of expenses. But is being efficient also being effective? Because you can cut a lot of things, but then the effective, how that affects the city and the citizen, always keep that in mind.
John said it at the very beginning, we're a service organization, right? We provide services across the board. Everything we do is there's no shareholders, there's no profit taking. None of that happens. In any of the departments, any of the enterprise funds, it's all service oriented. So when one of the overarching questions, if not the overarching question, is what the mayor just said. What level of service do the residents expect? And are we going to provide? And when we look at, when we entertain making a major cut somewhere, what we're really saying is we're going to cut back in service somewhere. And we have to ask ourselves, is that a service that the residents are going to tolerate at a reduced rate? Are you okay with, let's just take snow plowing. Right now, we get snow plowing done in about 4 to 6 hours. It used to take us 8 to 10 on fewer roads, but because we've got better equipment and things like that. Can you imagine what the outcry would be in a winter like this if all of a sudden, instead of the city being cleared in 4 hours,
To 2 days.
we went back to saying, okay, well, we can cut back. We're going to ban overtime for our drivers. So they can only clear during regular working hours. They're not going to be out there at 2 o'clock in the morning, clearing the streets so that you can get to work and get to school. So we're going to ban that. We're going to cut back on the number of trucks. It's going to take us 2.5 days after a storm to get the city completely cleared, just in time for the next storm to come. But we did save $500,000 doing that. I don't want to be the council member that faces that, because there's going to be heck to pay. And that's some of the balance that we look at as we go through this.
I'd say one other thing you need to ask too as we go through this. You want North Ogden to be a city or a community, right? Because the question always comes up, and I think the council's got a good handle on this, is public safety is number one. Keeping the citizens safe is number one. Okay. Obviously you want your toilets to flush, you want to have running water, you want to have your garbage picked up, those things. But the other thing is there are community events that the city pays for. That's what makes a city a community versus a city.
Cherry days, and things like that.
You know, you look at Cherry Days, you look at some of the other activities. You need to ask what is the role of government? We tried to not necessarily, not compete with private enterprise unless things get so out of hand that we have to do something on our own, but our philosophy is, we're not in the business to compete with private enterprise.
The Parks Department has a lot of services that they provide, sports programs and everything, and
Yeah, we don't, we have recreation activities. We try to keep the parks, last year, the parks looked like crap, right? Because there was no water.
That was mowing.
Yeah, he was mowing. But for instance, we only sprayed for weeds once. The weeds took over, right? So it's kind of what you want your city to be.
Every other week.
Yeah, you want, keep in mind, what do you want your city to be? What do you want it to look like? When people talk about North Ogden, what do you want it to be? But there's that situation, if you want it to just be a city and provide just required services, or do you want it to be a community? But even becoming a community, you still got to watch over, you don't want to be spending money on things that the citizens don't want either.
When I think community, I think of Mapleton. I came from Utah County 2 years ago. We live in Springville, but Mapleton's nothing but a bedroom community. There's no fast food places or service stations, nothing at all. It's just a residences, and that's it. And of course, we're a city because you got all these other things. You got businesses and things like that. A lot of it. Well, Mapleton's totally different.
Question. Are we going to follow Robert's rules?
You're not required to.
I don't think we want it.
Unless you want to bring a parliamentarian in to help you finish that.
Well, I've just done PTA and we did very basic Robert's rules, but I just wondered, how are we going to come to a decision? I have an opinion of what I would like to see in the next meeting. How are we going to come to those type of decisions? Is it going to be a majority? Is it whoever yells the loudest? How is that going
What's
to
your
be
opinion?
decided? My opinion for the next meeting? I think this was a good start, but I would really like at least the next meeting to continue to be a question and answer. Because there are more things that I have questions on that I would like to understand before I feel like I'm at the point that I can offer an opinion that I feel good about. So that would be my suggestion for the next meeting.
I'm good with that.
And
We just go home and decide. Because like I said, I have some questions about some things that were talked about today.
It can be helpful to have those questions ahead of time,
Right, and
so that we can have some
I'd be happy
prepared
to do
answers
that.
and have details for you. And if that's the consensus, that next meeting will be a continued Q&A, then get those questions, you can forward them to Randy. Who will
Send
bring
me
them
the
to-
email that's in the city newspaper.
Yeah,
I forget what the email address was, but can do
that's
that.
a good point.
and then we can have that list of questions up and ready to go, and that will surely spur additional questions.
My next question, sorry, as long as I've got the floor here, we have,
Wait, did we start the timer?
you start the timer, I'm good, less than 5 minutes. We have 2 co-chairmen, so does that mean that you will take turns chairing the meetings like you did today? Will she chair the next meeting? How will that go?
I don't know. Sandy, I must call you Brandy.
I believe
Sandy,
that's
do you want to
how,
answer that?
general plan went.
Mhm.
They had 2 co-chairmen and they took turns.
The idea of having 2 co-chairs was
Well, co-chair
Trust.
leads to,
right.
yeah, do it together.
Thrust upon us in an email. I'm not against it, but I'm open to suggestions. I will be quite frank and honest with you. I don't feel like a leader. And yet I was impassioned enough to start this thing a few months ago. And so here we are. And if I may, I'm not avoiding your question, just hold on a minute. Out of the 4 original people that kind of signed up for this, we added 4 more. We have a total of 8. 1 is not here. Clark Jensen's not here. Don't know why. But we have those, and then plus, I consider you kind of an appendix. If you
I'm
will.
I'm a liaison, not-
Yeah, you're not really one of us, you're a helper.
Yeah.
Communicate. So there are 8 people technically in this committee. And how we're gonna run it? Quite frankly, I'm open to opinions. Let's not do the whoever shouts loudest method. But I think we're all.
Can I offer an opinion?
And we can talk it out, and I'm not opposed to the question and answer. I think it's been suggested, and I'm for that.
If I could suggest, it seemed like if we have co-chairmen, that before the meeting, that you two ought to meet separately and pull together an agenda. And so that and then you guys can alternate who conducts the meeting, but you guys will have thought, but that's the way I do it anyway, is to have you guys get together and think out what the agenda, what the meeting should be. And then it doesn't matter which one of you conduct it, because you're on the same mind at that point. How do you feel, Sandy?
Yeah, I can see that. I can also see at the end of a meeting, the group forming the agenda for the next one, like what does the group, because I mean, Doug and I may have a certain vision and someone else is thinking something completely different that will not even dawn on either one of us. Or at least the other members give their input before the end of the meeting. And then we have a list of things that he and I can plan on.
And if the mayor wants me to collect questions, let's do that over the email. Send them to me on the email. And then
It's the email we have for you.
yeah, and then I'll see that the city gets access to those questions when we gather them all up and.
The central email for the city or yours?
No, send it to me.
To you
I'll-
personally.
I'll compile them and then I'll make sure the city and Phil gets a copy of it so that they're prepared to answer the questions next time.
To keep your meetings efficient, I would suggest that no more than 2 or 3 agenda items. Because they will invariably
Expand.
expand, right? Like this.
Now, like
Yeah,
Russian,
we-
they will expand, and so, you know, if perhaps the next meeting, the only agenda item is Q&A. And then you have the list of questions and we start going through the questions one by one, may not get through them all. But start going through those questions.
If I may, I'd like to suggest that we accept the idea of having a Q&A session next time, and let Randy be the collector of questions. I know some questions have already been emailed to me. If you would kindly re-email them to Randy and collect them.
The only reason I say that is the mayor just asked me to do it, so, yeah.
So I'm not opposed to that. A question that I am trying to get an answer to is, when shall our next meeting be?
And how often?
Yeah. Now, I have a question. The other committees, like the audit committee, Parks and Recreation, do they have a committee? How
It's a
many other-
separate entity.
How many other
It's a
committees are
private
there?
entity.
You're the only one. No, I don't mean citizen subcommittees. I mean official city committees, like,
Well, there's the Economic Development Committee.
okay, how often do they meet? I heard quarterly from the audit.
Quarterly, but if you meet quarterly, budget will be over by the time you guys meet again. So
Yeah, it seems like we've got a period of time between now and in about 3 months. If we want to have any input on the budget, we need to have several meetings.
our first council
between
budget
them.
meeting is March 28th.
I'd say
Okay,
2
so
weeks.
2
from
weeks.
today.
At least by week.
That's a good idea.
No. Okay, anybody opposed to 2 weeks?
What's that?
I'm
Today?
out of town.
John can answer the questions then.
Wrong link.
Tuesday, because I like to go to council meeting. So I'm here for 2 hours. I go home and have dinner and come back for 2 hours. I prefer not Tuesdays.
Okay, I collected the answers that everybody gave me, with the exception of Clark. I didn't get any answer from him. But only one person said that Saturday is best. That was you.
Saturdays are out.
Everybody else, because they don't set up weekends, so.
Yeah, it's fine. You just, because it's like, I'm gonna go back to work after this, so I'm okay. I just want-
We have to have what, when you're considering when your meeting is, remember that we're going to have staff here. We have to have at least John here
Okay.
because running the camera. So that's why in the email that I sent you, Monday through Friday before, no later than 3 o'clock. Is when the meetings need to be, because you're asking staff to be working overtime in evenings.
Oh,
In addition to all the other council meeting,
We already in the
economic
budget.
development, planning commission and everything else that we're doing. So, I mean, it's a sacrifice on all of our, I left work to be here today. Some of you left work to be here today. That's part of the sacrifice that we're making to be a part of this committee.
Sound like a Thursday then.
And so,
Thursday at 3.
John,
Thursdays are problematic for a family schedule. I apologize for, we just have to know that's it.
Wednesday seemed like a good.
Wednesday at 3.
Keeping in mind what Councilman Swanson just said, that it's maybe a sacrifice, no matter how we look at it.
you're not gonna
There's
pick a day that
never
everybody's-
going to be a place that pleases everybody, so.
And as long as I have, as long as I have a heads up, I'm always good. I can get on.
Let's do a vote. Okay. Let's say 3 o'clock. Monday, how many people for Monday? I'll count the votes.
I can do
Monday. 1, 2,
If everybody, if he's watching.
5, 6, 7. Okay, 8 for Monday, Tuesdays. Let's say not Tuesdays, the city council meeting. Tuesdays. Anybody could do Wednesday. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, 7 for Wednesday. Thursdays.
Thursday, he said without.
Oh.
And Fridays. Anybody for?
I have the password to Zoom, so.
Okay, so it's almost a tie between Monday and Wednesday, with Monday getting 8 votes and Wednesday getting 7.
Let's do Monday.
Monday, agreeable with everybody? We got it. So be it. Monday.
We'll just do it consensus.
So,
Monday, Monday.
Yes.
oh, you can do Monday?
From yesterday.
Oh, so,
The day of the week.
sorry,
You got something to say?
I didn't realize Jamie can't do Monday afternoon. She's got a granddaughter she's in
Can't
charge
do
of.
Monday afternoon.
So
Yeah.
we're going to second, which is Wednesday.
We're to Wednesday, 2 weeks from tomorrow.
So that's the 22nd.
Anybody opposed to Wednesday?
I will not be
2 weeks.
here on that Wednesday.
I won't either.
You won't either?
Just that one?
Just that one for me.
Ash
No,
Wednesday.
not on a competitive basis. so
No, just that one.
Hopefully we tolerate your.
What about you, Jenny? Is that just one for
It's
you?
just that one.
Okay, so let's,
And you can watch you can watch on YouTube.
Wednesdays
Yeah.
at 3
think
here,
so.
right?
Yes.
Okay,
Actually, on night I can.
And
Because Dave, you're the problem.
well, it just means that the answers are only be half as good.
the,
So the 22nd.
is that what,
Yeah. 22nd, 3 o'clock.
next one would be 22nd at 3 here. Okay, and then, email your, questions, comments, complaints, whatever they are, to Randy, your personal one, or to that one that's in the North Ogden City newspaper?
He wants it to be.
The RE win,
That one,
RE win 10.
that one that's here, okay.
Yeah.
That's your email or
He doesn't
email.
want to do
Yeah.
that.
So if we could do that in the next week, then I can get that to the city people.
Oh, yeah, that would be.
And for the week to do
Do it
something,
earlier.
yeah.
And the next week meeting by a week from
By
tomorrow?
By
or-
next Tuesday.
By next Tuesday, yeah.
Okay, so the deadline for questions is. Somebody speak the number of that. What's?
14.
14.
Yes.
Or.
27.
No.
22nd.
Just 1 week.
But the deadline for the
Oh.
questions is the 14th.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next. RE win 10 at what?
Gmail.com.
Answer your questions.
And this, did everybody get this roster?
Yeah, I think we got to email that to.
Well, you ought to do it and make it with the right,
Accurate.
well, yeah. Yeah,
Because he's not the liaison, you.
I'm the liaison. He's the council representative. I'm the liaison and you two are the chairman.
Who is the owner of this list?
I thought it was Susan.
Of the email address or of that list? Susan is the owner of that.
Yeah, and I informed her of that.
Our liaison, would you follow up?
Yeah, I didn't get it either.
Put out a corrected list.
Because your
think
email
that's
address was wrong.
Yeah, I did not get that.
So then I'll have her send it all out. to
Okay,
you
well,
all.
let me have that, and make sure my email's right. because it was
Yeah.
wrong.
In fact, you guys have the same email.
No, we don't.
Remember that, wait, we already did this, we already crossed this.
I know, but he doesn't have that.
With your phone. It already went to somebody who was supposed to get it corrected. right?
Yeah, that was Susan that corrected it. Yeah.
But it just hasn't been sent out yet.
Okay, I'll ask
Make sure
Susan
your
to send
email's
it
right
forward
on
it.
there. That way we want to
Anyway,
make it.
Randy,
We
will
want
you
to
keep
have a
us
job.
on?
I will. I'm just gonna keep this because I'm. You need. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I can write my stuff on there. so.
Yeah.
Okay, I move we adjourn the meeting.
Second. So.
Hey, and as we are adjourning, I request of the 8 people who are technically on here, and I talked to each of you as best I could, and one person got missed. But no, talk to everybody. Please be thinking about an area that you would like to specialize in, whether Parks and Recreation or the police department or water and sewer. So we're not everybody trying to do everything. Be thinking about that, what you'd like to specialize in.
And you don't ask.
Talk about that. Thank you.
So I tried that.
Randy, I'll give you questions. I'm not. Oh, makes you so sad.